This sermon is part of our ongoing series of Mother's Day series on founding mothers of Unitarian Universalism. In previous years, we've lifted up figures like Margaret Fuller, Julia Ward Howe, Olympia Brown, and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, women who helped shape our movement in profound ways. As UUs, we are lifted up on the shoulders of giants, many of whom were path-breaking women. When we share their stories, we're not only remembering their past, we're allowing their courage, their imagination, and their persistence to shape how we live our values today. Nevertheless, she persisted. On this Mother's Day, I want to share with you some insights from a new book titled Woman Spirit: The Rise of Feminism and the Empowerment of Women in Liberal Religion. It tells the story of how second-wave feminism helped transform Unitarian Universalism. This is a story not just about women entering ministry, but about changing how who is included changes what we believe, how we live, and what we imagine is even possible. And one of the clearest ways to see that transformation is to look at who was called to lead our congregations. As late as 1973, this is after a century of Unitarians and Universalists ordaining women, there were 4 women serving as ministers of UU congregations. But just 7 years later, by 1980, women made up more than 50% of UU seminarians. And by 1984, a tipping point had been reached. 15% of UU ministers were women. By 1988, that number had risen again. 20%, 1 in 5 UU ministers were women. Fast forward a little more than a decade to the year 2000, and Unitarian Universalist women ministers outnumbered their male counterparts 431 to 422. From just 4 women in the pulpit in 1973 to 431, a majority by the year 2000. That is more than a 100-fold increase in just under 3 decades. Now, maybe it still shouldn't have taken 3 decades, but that's remarkable. That is not just growth, that is a sea change in Unitarian Universalist ministry. To briefly zoom out to give you a broader perspective, this is a chart of clergy women in American denominations, a snapshot in 1977, 1994, and then 2017. Take a look at those pink bars on the left. In 1977, about 6% of Unitarian Universalist women were ministers. At that time, 4 other denominations actually had higher percentages of women. The United Church of Christ, which we lovingly chide them as being Unitarians considering Christ, it's on the left end of Christianity. They had 8% women, whereas we only had 6%. The Disciples of Christ, where I went to seminary, had 9.5%. Of women at that time. The Church in God in Christ had 9%. Now, that's a very conservative denomination. The Assemblies of God, again, very conservative, had 11% of women. And for many women within Unitarian Universalism, this gap was enraging. A movement that we pride ourselves on being progressive, and we were not living up to our ideals. Now move to those teal bars in the middle. 2 decades later, in 1994, about 30% of UU ministers were women, the highest percentage of any major religious group in the United States. They had channeled that rage productively. And then 2 decades further, to the tan bars on the right, by 2017, that number had risen to 57% of UU ministers were women, once again the highest of any religious group in the country. In just a few decades, Unitarian Universalists went from tailing behind to setting the pace. Now, it's one thing to see these statistics, but it's another thing entirely to feel what that kind of transformation actually felt like, especially if you were living through it. How many of you kind of lived through seeing the impact of second-wave feminism and really seeing these changes in our society? Because this shift, it wasn't just a shift in numbers. It was a shift in voice. It was a shift in authority. It was a shift in who is allowed to speak about what is spirituality, What is justice? What does it mean to live a meaningful life? I got you a new dishwasher. Isn't that enough? This was said, right? For generations, even within liberal religion, the pulpit had been overwhelmingly male. And that shaped not only who was seen as a possible spiritual leader. There's nothing wrong with being a nurse. But again, as you said, you actually do, though, have the choice between being a nurse or a doctor. And that's all the difference in the world. This was also like what was preached, which stories were told, whose experiences were taken seriously as sources of wisdom. And so when women began entering UU ministry in significant numbers, this is in the 1980s and the 1990s, they didn't simply step into existing roles and repeat what had always been said. They were bringing new questions, new experiences, new ways of understanding the sacred. And they asked, where are the voices of women in our history, our theology, our ethics? Why is it that so much of our language for the divine is only shaped by male imagery? What would it mean to take women's lived experiences seriously, not as an afterthought, but as an actual starting point? These questions didn't just change who was leading congregations, they changed how we talk, how we build community, and how we act in the world. Because when you change who is at the center, you don't just change the conversation, you change what counts as truth. As many of you have heard me say before, when you're not at the table, you might just end up on the menu. So how did this sea change in UU ministry happen? Its most immediate roots lie in the rise of second-wave feminism in the early 1960s. If second-wave feminism hadn't happened, I do not think you would have seen that exponential growth. A major inflection point came in 1963 when Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, giving rise to what she called the problem that has no name. The deep dissatisfaction many women felt in being confined only to domestic roles, despite having everything that they were told. This should make you happy. What's wrong with you? Right? You're the problem. And yet, even before Friedan's book, feminist theological questions were already beginning to emerge. 3 years earlier, in 1960, Valerie Saving, a religion professor at a small liberal arts college in upstate New York, published an essay titled "The Human Situation, a Feminine View." Saving made a simple but profound observation that for millennia, what had been treated and described as human nature was in fact drawn primarily from male experience. What theologians had long described as the central human problem of pride did not always reflect women's experience. For many women, the deeper struggle, especially in the culture of that time before second feminism, was not too much self, but too little. A tendency towards self-negation, toward losing oneself in caretaking of the needs and expectations of others. What had been called, again, human nature was in fact male nature, and what had been taught as universal theology was more accurately called male theology, shaped by men's experience. By the late 1960s and early 70s, feminist critiques were getting sharper and bolder. In 1968, Mary Daly published The Church and the Second Sex, and in 1973, she followed it with Beyond God the Father, toward a philosophy of women's liberation. In those works, Daly didn't just ask for women to be included in existing structures, she challenged the patriarchal structures themselves. These were the kind of books that were helping ignite the spark of women's liberation within Unitarian Universalism at a time when women made up less than 1% of UU ministers. Daly argued that a male-dominated church had shaped not only leadership, but the very language and imagery of the sacred. And she issued a provocative claim that echoed far beyond theology. She said famously, "Wherever God is male, male, I promise you, is God." In other words, when the divine is consistently imaged as male, it subtly reinforces the idea that men are closer to the sacred than women. This is my favorite photo of Mary Daly. She was truly an absolute legend. The very next year, in 1974, Mary Daly brought these ideas directly into our Unitarian Universalist movement. She led a workshop at UU General Assembly along with Gloria Steinem, the co-founder of Ms. Magazine. Daly, in particular, caused quite a stir during the question and answer period. She announced only women would be allowed to ask questions. Now, for some people in the room, that felt shocking, even unfair. But that was precisely her point. For generations, men's voices had dominated public, intellectual, and religious life. Daly was trying, even if just for a moment, to create a different kind of space, one where women's voices could be centered, respected, and taken seriously. All of this and more helped set the stage for UU General Assembly in 1977. That year, our UU General Assembly not only passed a Women and Religion resolution calling us to examine sexist language and the patriarchal roots of our theology, we also elected our first woman moderator, Sandra Karen. And the moderator of the UUA presides over monthly UUA board meetings and also presides over the business at General Assembly. So this is not just symbolic. It was a real shift in leadership at the highest levels of our movement. One of the most visible changes that followed that resolution was a call to confront and change the sexist language that was embedded in the original 1961 version of our UU principles. At the time, our principles included phrases like the universal truths immemorially summarized in the Judeo-Christian heritage as love to God and love to man. And that represents everybody, right? Love to man. The dignity of man, the ideals of brotherhood, cooperation with men of goodwill in every land. Language like that may once have sounded universal, but it centered men as the default for what it means to be human. These new ways of seeing were not happening in isolation. It took nearly a decade for those changes that were called for in 1977 with that Women in Religion resolution to come to fruition. And during that interim period, I want to share just a few representative examples of major feminist theological works that were helping build this pressure for change. I think we've seen this in our own time, especially like post-Ferguson. We've seen this similar like emergence of books around racial justice that were really helping build this pressure for change and helping people see in new ways. These books weren't just academic, they were shaping how ministers, seminarians, and congregations were beginning to think and act differently. In 1978, Mary Daly published Gynecology, the meta-ethics of radical feminism. That was published by our own UU Beacon Press. It was a bold and controversial book that creatively stretched and twisted and reinvented language itself using wordplay, etymology, and satire to reveal how deeply patriarchy shapes our language, our religion, our culture. That same year, Phyllis Tribble published God and the Rhetoric of Sexuality. That took a very different approach. Rather than rejecting the tradition, she returned to the biblical texts themselves, reading them with fresh eyes to uncover overlooked and often liberating interpretations of women's stories within Scripture. Because it turns out when women are reading the Bible, they notice things that men miss. Daly disrupted the tradition from the outside, while Tribble worked to transform it from within. In 1979, Judith Plaskow's The Coming of Lilith, also published by our own Beacon Press, began reimagining Jewish theology from a feminist perspective. That same year, she also co-edited Women's Spirit Rising with Carol Christ, a groundbreaking anthology, again, published by our own UU Beacon Press, that brought together voices across traditions to articulate a new emerging feminist religious consciousness. In 1979 as well, that's when Starhawk published The Spiral Dance, helping spark this resurgence of earth-centered spirituality. Even to today, we have once a month, earth-centered spirituality in our chapel. I hope you can feel the energy building, these new questions, new communities, new possibilities. These books were not sitting unread on library shelves. By 1980, when nearly half of UU seminarian classes were made up of women, these were some of the works that were helping shape this next generation of UU ministers. By 1983, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza's In Memory of Her, a feminist theological reconstruction of Christian origins, helped recover the often erased leadership of women in the earliest Jesus movements. That same year, Rosemary Radford Ruether's Sexism and God Taught, a fourth major feminist work published by our own Beacon Press in this very short period of time, provided one of the first comprehensive, systematic feminist theologies, rethinking core Christian symbols and language and doctrine through the lens of women's experience. My point is not to overwhelm you with books, though I know I do that, but to help you see them, that there was this rising tide reshaping how people understood the sacred, spirituality, and their own lives. And remember that by 1985, that wave was becoming visible in UU ministry itself. Women had just become 15% of UU ministers. These books, they just didn't exist before this. I just don't know. We can take this stuff for granted right now, but these books were like life preservers to people who just had never seen. This just wasn't happening before second wave feminism. So after 8 years from 1977, 8 years of reflection and debate and discernment, in 1985 at UU General Assembly, we finally completed a 2-year voting process to adopt a far more gender-inclusive version of our UU principles. That same year, 1985, Sandra Karen fell short in her bid to become the first woman UU president, but Kay Montgomery was appointed the executive vice president, the second highest staff position of the UUA, a role that she then held for 28 years and was incredibly influential in our movement. It would take another 3 decades until 2017 for a woman to be elected as UU president, the Reverend Susan Frederick Gray. She was succeeded by the Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt, the first woman of color and openly queer person elected to that role. Her term continues through 2029. Let me also share why this story we've been telling matters to me personally. I invite you to think about parallels in your own life. When I first studied the historical Jesus for the first time as an undergraduate religion major, my professor was Shelley Matthews, an unapologetic feminist whose doctoral advisor at Harvard was Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, whose groundbreaking book I mentioned earlier. As a seminarian, my Hebrew Bible professor was Tony Craven, another strong feminist who taught me the revelatory importance of paying close attention to all of the women in the Bible, both named and unnamed. When I studied theological ethics, it was with Stacey Floyd Thomas, who taught explicitly from feminist, womanist, and mujerista perspectives. And when I studied Christian history, it was with Daisy Machado, who emphasized a Latina feminist perspective. Taken together, these and other teachers, they didn't just expand what I and other students knew. They reshaped how we understood and experienced the world. They taught me that who gets to speak, whose stories are told, whose perspectives are taken seriously, fundamentally changes how we understand history, ethics, spirituality, even the nature of the sacred itself. When you change who you pay attention to, you change what is considered possible. It is also important to acknowledge that, like many movements, second-wave feminism was not without serious limitations. Many early feminist spaces centered the experiences only of white middle-class women, did not adequately grapple with race and class, sexuality, disability, global perspectives. It would take later womanist, mujerista, Asian, queer, and post-colonial theologians to push feminist theology to become broader, deeper, more intersectional. And all of this matters because we are not merely observers of history. We are participants in it. We are making the history right now that future generations, that will be their history. We are challenged not just to study what happened then, but to ask ourselves, what will we do next? Whose voices will we listen to, center, and learn from? Today, we need to be honest that in so many ways, the feminist values that we have been celebrating this morning are under direct assault from the highest echelons of power. But as the writer and activist Rebecca Solnit reminds us, one of the greatest mistakes that people make about feminism is assuming that if it hasn't finished the work, it must have failed. As if something as old and entrenched as patriarchy could be dismantled in a single lifetime. She continually reminds us that feminism is this ongoing living force, one that has already reshaped laws, culture, and expectations and everyday life in ways we completely take for granted, even as the backlash continues. And that sounds a lot like the story we've been telling this morning. Because Unitarian Universalism, we did not become more gender inclusive overnight. It took decades of voices raised, of ideas written and shared, of people willing to say we are not yet living up to our values. And then slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably, change came. From 4 women in pulpits to nearly half of seminarians to a majority of ministers to leaders at the very highest levels of our movement. Not perfect, not complete, but real and transformative. The stories that we tell matter. And telling these stories reminds us that seismic change continues to be possible. It's possible now because we've seen it possible then. So our challenge now is the same as it was then, to continue that transformation, because our future, like our past, will be shaped by who is included, whose stories are told, and whether we have the courage to become more fully who we say we want to be. If we want a fuller truth, we must widen who counts.
Two final quick things. One, whenever I look at this hymnal from time to time, I just say, this hymnal was published in 1993, and it is tremendously a product of second wave feminism. That if you've ever been here for like a Christmas Eve service and been like, those aren't the lyrics I remember, or it's because of second wave feminism. There's just like, we will change the lyrics, like we're gonna make them more inclusive. Or for example, the compilers of this hymnal really wanted to include John Lennon's Imagine in our hymnal, but that has one word in there, the brotherhood of man, right? And we said we will not include it unless we can change the word brotherhood. And the John Lennon estate said, no, you're not changing that. So that is the story of why Imagine is not in our hymnal, but we still sing it anyway. It's just not in the hymnal. A final thing I wanted to share is that when I went to seminary, so I grew up Southern Baptist, and it was a real open question, and still is within Southern Baptists, of can women be ministers? And there was one woman appointed deacon during my childhood, and then never again. And so it was, but by the time I got to college, I was always all for, to me it just seemed obvious that, women were like basically leading this church, except for the minister. But when I got to seminary, my roommate it was a Disciples of Christ seminary. He had grown up Disciples of Christ with a woman minister. That was one of those 4 denominations that were ahead of Unitarian Universalism in 1977. So for him growing up as a young boy, it wasn't a question. Of course, women could be ministers. My minister is a woman. So these things just, they matter. We can begin to take them for granted, but it matters, representation, it matters so much. So as we continue into the rest of this day and the week to come, continue your journey with love at the center. Control what you can control. Care for one another. Care for this one earth. Do justice and make peace. And as you go, whatever taste or touch you might have had in this time and place of even just a little more hope or love or peace or joy, that goes with you into the world. We're different for having spent this time together. And even in this very hard time, continue to look for and savor all that still remains good and true and beautiful. May you live boldly. May you live with thanksgiving.